Hello, I'm Daniel Searle with WCAT, and we have a special guest with us today. Rosetta Ryong Lee from the Seattle Girls Schools is on campus to talk about diversity initiatives, how to think about race, and especially the Asian experience. Has spent the day today, Wednesday, with our faculty, and we'll also be visiting with the students in assembly on Thursday. Welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit? One of the main messages you shared with the faculty was about the Asian experience, and Asian, that term being just a construct that people put together. It's a lot wider than that.
Yeah, so I think oftentimes when somebody says Asian, automatically what they picture is East Asian heritage folks. So China, Japan, Korea, Taiwanese, etc. But ultimately, in the census, the category is really arbitrary in that it contains East Asians, it contains South Asians like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. It's got South Asians, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and oftentimes the term is called Asian Pacific Islander. And so Pacific Islands include things like Native Hawaiian folks or Samoans or Polynesians and Filipinos. And so if you think about the various physicalities, the various languages, customs, geography, etc., it really is an artificial construct that tries to lump together really diverse groups of people. And in fact, the borders are constantly ever changing because they're, for the example that I used this morning was when U.S.-Russian relations were really tense because of the Cold War, there was a move to try to reclassify Russians as Asians, and then when the political tension is over, all of a sudden the categorization is white. And so these terms of racial identity or racial grouping is always a social construction, meaning people made it up to for political or economic reasons. So.
As you mentioned with the Russians, once the relationship got a little bit better,
Yeah.
congratulations, you're white now.
Exactly.
And who gets to make that call? Who gets to decide and impose that view?
So it's been made by different governmental bodies. So, one of the examples that I used this morning was there were Supreme Court cases where folks of Asian heritage actually tried to have the courts define them as white at a time when the only access to citizenship was to be identified white American or black American. And so Japanese heritage folks, Indian heritage folks actually went to court to be classified as white, and then the Supreme Court constantly kept on changing definitions, which basically said, as Asians, you can't be considered white. Um, and then there's also census takers as a body constantly redefines, and actually every single racial groups. If you look at census categorizations for race, since the beginning till now, you're going to find that you could be the same person and be classified 17 different ways over the course of history. So,
How about that? Somewhat arbitrary and
yes.
artificial, as you
Mm-hmm.
say. Help us out with some of the nomenclature,
Mm-hmm.
APA, API, some
Mm-hmm.
acronyms. What do those
Mm-hmm.
mean, and who falls under those categories?
Sure. And so when folks say Asian, oftentimes I'm talking about like East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians. Sometimes the term is APA, which is Asian Pacific American, meaning you know how there's Asian people and then there's Asian Americans, right? So APA is Asian Pacific Americans trying to enfold the Pacific Islander experience into the Asian American experience. And then API is an acronym for Asian Pacific Islands. And so depending on people's national origin, their ethnic identity, their current citizenship, etc., they may identify themselves by their ethnicity. So they can say, I'm Korean, I'm Cambodian, I'm Indian, I'm Sri Lankan. They can identify themselves racially, I'm Asian Pacific Islander. Or they can talk about their current ethnic identity. So, when people ask me, what are you, right? I'm like, well, um, national origin wise, I am Korean. Uh, Racial identity wise, I am Asian Pacific Islander. Ethnicity wise, my current culture is Korean American because there are aspects of my Korean culture that show up and aspects of my American culture that show up in my daily life. And so identity has to be defined by the person and their current relationship and understanding of what those terms mean.
It's a very good point there. And how would you help our students, mostly high school age, to that 14 to 18 window, working on learning their own identity to feel comfortable in each of those boxes, categories, based on where they come from, the parents, and their own experiences?
I would say the important thing is to recognize that identity is a deeply personal thing, and at the same time, we live in a world where we are taught to categorize and assume things about each other based on some very surface differences. And so I think the important thing is to investigate and connect and take ownership of what you want, understand that we still live in a world where a lot of people will make assumptions based on some limited information about you. And how do you engage with folks across difference in a way that says, um, I'm deeply curious about you, and I hope you're deeply curious about me, and beyond the surface assumptions that we are taught to make of one another.
Very interesting. And you mentioned in your talk this morning, we've already mentioned the Supreme Court case and who gets to make the call on who you are, what you are. The 20-60-20 concept, where there's a 60% in the middle that can be swayed one way or another. Can you expand on that concept a little bit, please?
Sure. I think whenever you have change, historical change or attitude change, policy change over time, you're going to find that there's a whole bandwidth of attitudes toward that change. You're going to have some, the 20%ers who are really excited about that change, really want it to happen and want it to happen quickly, and they feel like it should have happened a while back. And there's 20% of the population who really don't want that change to happen. They're like, I don't care how much evidence you show me, I refuse to believe that that's a good idea. And 60% of the population could go either way. So the example that I used this morning was pre-civil rights versus post-civil rights. Pre-civil rights movement, it wasn't that there were more white people who were inherently believing in Jim Crow segregation or racial inequity. There were many people for whom it was a fundamental wrong, and they felt really conflicted about that and against it. And
Right, you said it, you feel it in your gut, right?
Exactly. And there were some folks who absolutely thought that this was the correct hierarchy that should exist in society. And 60% of the population basically went along with what was the current policy at the time, which was separate facilities, separate education, separate everything, right? And post civil rights, the after a lot of sacrifice and hard work and community efforts, the rhetoric changed, thanks to policy changes, thanks to more leaders being willing to stick their neck out and say what needed to be said. The climate shifted so that most white Americans would say it's not right to racially separate or segregate or see people of color as fundamentally less than whites. And there's a greater understanding now that like saying things like that are just simply wrong, right? But that didn't happen because of deep internal changes. That happened because the rhetoric changed. And what was the correct thing to do changed. And the 60% were swayed. And so for me, if we want to create inclusion, we need to actually not spend all of our energy trying to convince the 20%ers who don't want to come along. It's actually like, how do we get more voice and access and swaying power out there toward inclusion and fairness and equity?
So you talk about inclusion. That's going to be the key right there in finding one's own identity. We could go on and on about this topic. Thank you so much for spending time with us and informing both our students and our faculty and some of our parent groups here at Westminster.
Thank you so much.
So this is Rosetta Unyoung Lee. I'm Daniel Searle for WCAT. Go Cats.